Olá, boa tarde a todos e a todas que estão aí conosco, nos assistindo, participando conosco dessa atividade. Gostaria de agradecer imensamente a todas as pessoas que se dispuseram a estar aqui conosco. Quero agradecer em especial os meus alunos e alunas. Vou explicar um pouquinho para vocês, né, a dinâmica da nossa aula de hoje, né? Não gostaria de chamar de evento, mas é uma aula aberta do programa de pós-graduação em estudos da linguagem, o PPGEL, da Universidade Estadual de Londrina. Então, nesse programa de pós-graduação, eu ministro a disciplina Ensino, Aprendizagem e Avaliação de Línguas nos anos iniciais do ensino fundamental. E dentro dessa disciplina, então, a gente tem um módulo, né, uma disciplina que fala de vários aspectos sobre o ensino, a aprendizagem, formação de professores, para atuar, então, na educação linguística, né, o que nós temos agora mais enfocado numa perspectiva de educação linguística, na infância e para a infância. E dentro dessa disciplina, então, nós temos um módulo que é dedicado exclusivamente à avaliação. Então, nós estamos justamente nesse momento da disciplina, desse módulo, e é com muita alegria, então, que nós decidimos fazer essa aula aberta para que mais pessoas pudessem também vivenciar, trocar ideias, experiências, né? É a terceira vez, né? O terceiro ano que eu oferto essa disciplina, e acho que agora, com essa situação toda, né, de pandemia, eu tenho dito a alguns colegas em outros espaços, né, que acho que nós temos que tentar tirar outras oportunidades dessa situação que nós estamos vivendo, né? Então, acho que um lado positivo da pandemia, se é que a gente pode dizer isso, é que nós criamos um pouco de coragem de sair das nossas caixinhas, de sair das nossas paredes e utilizar a tecnologia para tentar estabelecer conexões e diálogos, né, com outras pessoas e, nesse caso, com pessoas de outros países. Então, eu vou pedir licença, né, àqueles que me ouvem nessa tarde, que estão aqui conosco nesse momento. Acho que, como foi divulgado, a aula de hoje, ela será, então, ministrada em língua inglesa, né, porque nós temos, então, a professora Dina Tsagari, que estará conosco, juntamente com a professora Gladys Quevedo-Camargo. So, I would like to introduce you. I'm very, very happy to introduce you Professor Dina Tsagari. Hello, Dina.
Hello, good evening, good afternoon.
Yes,
it's very late where I am. So
for us, it's still afternoon, but I think that for you is late, right?
Yes.
So, Dina, I'd like to once again to thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I'm going to read something about you so that people can get to know you a bit more. We have been reading your papers. We know you are doing, you have been doing all over many years a great job on the issue. So Professor Dina Tsagari holds a PhD. She is a professor in the Department of Primary and Secondary Teacher Education in Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. So that's why it's late for her, because she's in Norway right now. She has also worked for the University of Cyprus, Greek Open University, and Polytechnic University of Hong Kong. Her research interests include language testing and assessment, materials design and evaluation, differentiated instruction, multilingualism, Distance Education and Learning Difficulties. And she is the editor and author of numerous books, journal papers, book chapters, project reports, etc. Dina Tsagari also coordinates research groups, and we are very, very happy to have you here, Dina. So that's how we're going to do. Just for people know the dynamic of our class today. I'm going to, I think I'm going to break the what we have settled here. I would like just to say hello to Gladys. Gladys, can you say hello?
Sure. Hello, good afternoon. Hello, Dina. Very nice to see you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to see you, Gladys, and I'm very happy to be here today.
So,
thank you for coming.
Okay, so we are going to do the following. Dina is going to talk to us about assessment, and then I will formally introduce Professor Gladys Quevedo-Camargo so that we can hear from her. Okay? Thank you so much, Gladys. And Dina, so you have, be free to, you are at home. You are literally at home. Feel yourself comfortable.
Okay. As I said before, thank you so much, Juliana. This is a wonderful opportunity to be talking to wonderful people with an interest in assessing young learners or teaching young learners. So thank you very much for the invitation. I hesitated for not more than half a second, thinking like, okay, there might be a little bit of something with regard to timing, but it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight or this afternoon. So I'm going to be sharing my slides in a minute, but I'd like to tell the audience that I won't be able to see you. Only I'm going to be looking at are the slides. So if there are any pauses in between or my voice goes up or down a little bit, that's because, you know, it's always nice to look at people's faces, but we don't have that opportunity. So I'll do my best to carry out this in as much lively manner as possible. So I'm going to be sharing the screen. So Juliana, just stay with me for a minute to signal that you can see the slides.
Okay.
And I'm going to be sharing. So when I just pop them up, is it there? Can you see them?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me see. Okay. Now, can you see the first slide?
Yes.
Juliana?
Yes.
Yes?
Now
okay.
it's on the screen. Yes.
Great. And is it full view?
Yes, it's full.
Okay, great. So I don't have to worry about anything else.
No.
So I think we can get started. And if I take more time, please shout, Juliana. Okay.
Yes. Okay, I will.
Because when I talk about assessment, I just forget time.
I know the feeling. I know the feeling.
Okay. Great. So I'm going to start with putting assessment first on the map and familiarizing everybody who's listening to us tonight with some basic principles and some basic understanding of assessment before looking at young learners. I understand that assessment is challenging, but it's also very interesting, and the benefits are really great once somebody organizes a systematic way of assessing and evaluating the performance of young learners. I think it's only benefits that you can gain out of that. But I'd like to start with asking all of you, and I'm going to stop for a moment to ask the question, what do you understand with the terms evaluation, assessment, and testing? So I'm just going to stop for a moment so that you can all ponder and reflect on the question. Before I give you the answer, I'm not planning to torture you, but just to get us into the field of that we will be discussing today. So how do we understand the terms evaluation, assessment, and testing? Are they the same? We tend to use them interchangeably sometimes, but they might be different. But let me give you a quick answer by taking you through some of the slides that I have here in this PowerPoint presentation. And I would like to start with the term evaluation. And we get to do a lot of evaluation, but not necessarily evaluation of students. We do evaluation of methodology, for example, of teaching materials, of courses and learning curricula. And we tend to use the word evaluation when it comes to looking at teachers' methods, for example, or learning materials. But when it comes to evaluating students' performance, we tend to use the word assessment. And there are two ways of doing assessment, or actually many more ways, but two approaches of conducting assessment. The summative approach, very frequently referred to as testing, and quite a lot of us understand testing through paper and pencil tests. And I think that all of us are familiar with this process, which might look like this, or like that, especially when it's high stakes exams in some countries like, for example, Korea or Japan, for many years have been conducting high stakes exams, especially university entrance exams that might be very hard on students, and they could be delivered in environments like this. But nowadays, with the COVID situation, quite a lot of these kind of exams are organized like this, maybe in the open air, and students are required to wear mouth masks. But testing is not only paper and pencil tests, but testing can be conducted using technology, for example, computer-based tests or computer adaptive tests. And I'm going to be referring to just a handful of examples where computer-based tests are taken in very special spaces, like what you see on top left picture, where the student is looking at a screen and using a mouse and a keyboard and a keypad and keyboard to type the answers to questions. And there are quite a lot of these kind of tests that are on the market, commercialized tests, like, for example, Pearson is offering the PT Academic and Bulatz, and ETS is offering TOEFL Junior online, but also computer-based tests that are free, like, for example, the Dialang test that is freely accessible, and it does what it says it does, diagnoses language performance at the 6 levels of the CFR. I highly recommend those of you who are learning languages other than English, for example, to try out your level of English. But computer-based tests and computer adaptive tests are not only administered through examination committees like, for example, ETS or Pearson, but in Norway, for instance, we are conducting computer-based tests for level 5, 8, and 10 that look like this. This is the first item of an example for level 5, where a short text is presented on the left-hand side, and students are asked to find who the person is by clicking on one of the pictures. As the students are working on the test that comprises of 44 items, the texts are becoming longer, and they're presented with different types of questions, like multiple choice questions like this. Text also can be presented in small parts like this one, that is that text is presented as a multiple choice, and students need to find the right text that represents the picture on the left-hand side. And as I said, as the students are progressing through the texts are getting longer, and the tasks are becoming a little bit more demanding. So coming back to what I was saying before, it's not just the big names like Cambridge or Pearson, but it's also national computer-based tests. But teachers very often use Google Forms, Kahoot, and Duolingo these days, and other types of platform to organize their own computer-based tests. But assessment is not just done through testing, but teachers very often, for classroom-based purposes, use informal, alternative, continuous, or formative types of assessment, very often carried out through self and peer assessment, organized in portfolios, diaries, and projects. And this is an example of teacher-made or teacher-initiated portfolios for students, or the more standardized forms like the European portfolio of languages, which is a document in which those who are learning or have learned a language, whether at school or outside school, can record and reflect on their language learning and cultural experiences, with very strong links with the CFR, especially the self-assessment grade and common reference levels. In Norway, we have the Norwegian European language portfolio for students between ages of 6 to 12, that comprises of the three different parts, where self-assessment is presented in fun scales that teachers can use, also outside the space and the scope of the ELP. And also there's the European language portfolio for students between the ages of 13 to 18. And all of this is freely accessible on the website of the Ministry of Education. But now I'd like to raise a few questions. And I hope you're all okay so far, because I'm going to go quick now. And of course, the big question that I didn't ask at the beginning, because I wanted to position all of us within this huge assessment landscape, is why should we assess? And actually, why should we assess our students' performance? Well, first and most primarily, actually, because students need to know where they stand in relation to their learning, and they need to become more self-aware of their abilities and skills. But also, we assess students' performance because teachers want to find out about students' skills, knowledge, and abilities, and because teachers continuously feed back the results of the assessment into their teaching and learning process with an aim of improving the effectiveness of their teaching and curricula. But of course, parents, head teachers, principals, and other stakeholders, they want to learn about the progress of the students. To the question, what do we assess? Of course, when it comes to language, we assess vocabulary, grammar, reading, writing, listening, speaking. But of course, in the everyday routine in the classroom, we also look at other aspects outside language. And very often we look at students' work habits. For example, how punctual or well prepared our students are, especially when it comes to young learners, how cooperative or risk-taking or enthusiastic or shy, or how actively they participate in the classroom in an attempt to form a broader profile of our students. There are different types of tests in particular that teachers might engage in designing and administering and marking, from quizzes and progress tests to placement tests, achievement and diagnostic tests, and even proficiency tests that are big tests. Teachers are very often invited to design questions or items by the examination boards or examination units. And qualities of a good language test or a good language assessment, even though Gladys will gladly expand on this, but I'm just taking the opportunity to go through this to introduce the discussions later on, are validity. This is very important when it comes to organizing effective assessment. Our language assessment needs to be valid, it needs to be reliable, practical, and it needs to produce positive impact, positive effect or washback effect on what's happening in the classroom. And of course, there's a lot more terminology that I'm not going to go in. For example, learning-oriented assessment, performance-based assessment, dynamic assessment, but I'm going to save you from that. And I'm only going to pick on two very frequently used acronyms, AFL and AOL, probably because most of you must have come across that. And by assessment for learning, we actually mean, and it has a purpose, is to improve learning by checking what learners are progressing. And to do this, they can then decide whether to give additional help, try a different explanation, or use different materials when learners find things difficult, or whether to provide more challenging activities when learners are ready for this. And another approach very frequently used these days is assessment of learning, very often related to judging how successful learners have been in mastering the content of a course in order to report this to parents, schools, and management and educational authorities. Very frequently, assessment for learning is referred to as formative assessment, and assessment of learning is referred to as summative assessment. But it's not really like this, but I don't want to take your time. But just remember AFL and AOL acronyms, because they will be handy, especially when you explore the resources that I'm going to be presenting in a minute. So 1 minute, if you want to take down any questions that you will probably be having after so much input, because we're going to be answering questions at the end of our presentations. So just a little bit of time here for you to breathe. And maybe put down a couple of questions. Okay, I'm going to move now to young learners, because so far it's been a lot about assessment. Young learners, what do we mean by young learners? Well, we could be talking about young learners depending on our systems and our context. Very often young learners maybe perhaps will refer to different age groups. So young learners could be as young as 5 to 8 year olds, but also young learners are referred to groups of 9 to 12 year olds, and in some systems they can be as old as 13 to 17 year old. So some of the characteristics of young learners, and I'm sure that most of you already have worked with young learners, is that they are still developing their cognitive, socio-cognitive and linguistic and affective skills and abilities. So when it comes to assessing young learners, these characteristics and these factors need to be considered. Also, variability is another very important aspect, because it signals individual differences between learners. The content of language learning, that is the skills, vocabulary, and language use, are very important to remember in any attempt to assess students' performance, and consider those when any one of us is thinking of how and what to assess. In tandem with that, methods of teaching need to be considered as well, because students will be surprised to see different types of tasks that they need to engage when doing assessment. And especially if they're very different from methods of assessment, this can create confusion, and maybe perhaps stress levels might increase, and we don't want that to happen. And of course, one needs to take the aims of language learning, the social, cultural, and language learning aims into consideration when thinking about the assessment of young learners. So on defining constructs and designing and implementing assessment and using the assessments afterwards, we need to identify age-appropriate tasks and formats of assessment. We need to understand the role of teachers in classroom-based assessment, because this is relatively different from administering standardized international language exams. And of course, the consideration of the influences of assessment on learning, very often referred to as washback effect, but also on motivation and other affective domains, are very important. So to the 5 to 8 year olds who are still learning about the world around them and speak and write, but try to get the grammar right and absorb loads of new words and repeat everything you say, maybe perhaps a way to assess their vocabulary could be to shout out the words you slowly can reveal a picture that can be really fun, and they won't even know that they're being tested. So this is just an example of the very many things you can do for the little ones, the very young ones. For a group of 9 to 12 year olds where vocabulary is growing quickly, and they can understand and explain more complicated thoughts, and where the world knowledge is still growing but attention expanding is increasing, one could use assessment tasks that are fun and not too long. But given that friends at this stage are important, it would be a good idea to do speaking activities for assessment purposes with a friend, and also bring in role plays, like, for example, going shopping or writing a shopping list first and then asking for things in a shop. For the 13 to 17-year-olds that go through a lot of changes and are really interested in the world around them, and they like to learn about new cultures, new ideas and ways of life in different countries, and this can go actually into reading and writing tasks, and their friends are also equally important. Having a speaking test in pairs or groups would be a good choice, and vocabulary words that you can test at this stage that are not the same as those in a test for adults, and also not as much life experience as adults, and they're still trying to keep talking, by providing more support than an adult to help them get through an activity would be the way to go in a formalized assessment task. But however, even if each group has different needs and speeds of development, they all need to have some elements of fun and interest in a language test, for example. And teachers need to help them to demonstrate their knowledge to the very best of their ability. So when conducting assessment with young learners, it is very important to remember to create an atmosphere of calm and fun activities, to avoid stressing the importance of doing well in a forthcoming test or any other type of assessment that you're planning, to reward students for participating, to use a reward system such as a wall chart, for example, with stickers or stamps, and to use assessment tasks which are authentic. But other than tests, it is important to introduce alternatives in assessment as a way to help students achieve their learning goals. I'm going to take you now through this next part of the presentation titled Research. So are you ready for some research findings? I hope you are, because I'm going to be drawing from work that I've been doing with a number of colleagues on a number of projects, and I'd like to share some of the findings with you, basically to feel a little bit more comfortable with assessment and to see how others in other countries are experiencing assessment and what they're doing in their classrooms. So I'd like to start with a project that finished in 2018, but we're still conducting a lot of work on the results of that project that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later. Through that project, we tried to gauge the language assessment literacy of teachers and students around Europe, and the work has already been published in a paper that came out last year. To those of you who come across language assessment literacy for the first time, I just picked this definition for LAL, as we often refer to, which means or refers to the ability to design, develop, and critically evaluate tests and other assessment procedures, as well as the ability to monitor, evaluate, grade, and score assessments on the basis of theoretical knowledge. So I'm taking language assessment literacy as a starting point to introduce part of a very big project, and actually in terms of results and data, that we conducted in 4 countries, namely Cyprus, Hungary, Germany, and Greece. And these are the numbers with teachers and students we worked with. We sent out 2 online questionnaires, one to teachers and one to students, and I'm just going to report to a tiny little fraction of the results that we got back. So to one of the questions that we raised in those questionnaires, which was about the skills and areas the teachers and students are assessed on, the results that we came out with was a picture like that, where teachers and students in the assessment practices and assessment realities that they experience get to do a lot of assessing of writing, vocabulary, grammar, reading, speaking, and listening. But there seems to be already visible that there is a small contradiction actually with in terms of the amount of vocabulary that students think their teachers assess them in, reading and listening. And I would like to come back to these contradictions a little bit later. We also ask teachers and students, how often do you use the following assessment methods? And from what it seems on this graph, a lot of teachers would do a class or consider class participation as a method of assessment. They would distribute tests with closed items like gaps or multiple choice items. They would ask students to write extended writing like letters and essays. They would engage the student in oral presentations, but less and less on self-assessment, peer assessment, and portfolio assessment. Again, students seem to contradict their teachers a little bit in terms of understanding or thinking that oral presentations or translations are used as a means of assessment. So the question of what kind of feedback you or your teacher give on learners or your assessment results, teachers and students more or less agree that marks such as percentages, points, and letter grades are frequently used. But the rest of the types of feedback, such as brief comments, detailed comments on work, or comments and hints on how to improve learning, it seems the teachers and students don't agree with each other. But it's interesting to see that where they agree is the quantitative form of feedback. We also looked at differences between the countries, the 4 countries that participated in that project, only to find that, of course, there are contextual differences. For instance, in Greece, speaking is not as frequently assessed as in other countries. Writing is assessed less than Cyprus, Greece, and Hungary, and so is vocabulary, grammar, and reading. And listening, for example, does not seem to get the attention in Greece compared to the rest of the countries. I'm just going to skip a little bit some of the slides because I think I'm taking up too much time, but it's interesting to see what teachers said in terms of how confident they feel about assessing reading, writing, and other skills. And so when we ask teachers how confident they feel about various aspects of assessment, this is what they told us. They feel strong, they feel very confident when it comes to assessing reading and writing, but less and less confident when it comes to assessing other types of or using other types of assessment like self-assessment, peer assessment, using student portfolio, or assessing students with special learning needs. And so to the question, what kind of training needs should be prioritized? As you see, this has been the reverse order, where the majority of our teachers said that assessing students with language needs or using student portfolio and self-assessment is the areas that they would like more training in. But I'd like to pick up on some of the extracts from the interviews we conducted in this project and other projects from teachers who told us that in their everyday life in the classroom, when it comes to assessment, one of our interviewees said that, oh, you know, it's very easy. You just collect bits and pieces and you ask your colleagues how they do it. And this is how I do it. Another teacher said, well, to be honest with you, I was heavily dependent on the methods of assessment in the teacher book. And this brings into the discussion the responsibility of publishing houses and teachers' books that very often we rely on in terms of assessment, and how important it is for these kind of publications to include good and valid types of assessment, at least recommended for teachers. These are some more extracts from more interviews. Another teacher said, oh, we use pair or group work. Other teachers said we assess our students through singing activities. Another teacher said we usually have some mini-scale projects. For instance, we work with a small story, The Three Little Pigs. Then I prepare a small project for them, which I then used as a form of evaluation. Other extracts from interviews, another interviewee said, well, I love doing writing conferences with my pupils so that pupils learn how to give fair feedback and get fair feedback in the same way. It's a very constructive way of feedback. And another one said, I give a rating based on a general impression, but other than that, I do not use anything else. And all of this made us think that not everybody understands assessment, at least not the way we expect teachers to understand it. And I think that the lessons we learned is that teachers' language assessment literacy is a very important aspect of language teaching and learning. And we need to prioritize language assessment in training programs we offer to teachers. But of course, contextual factors and parameters should not only concern research projects, but they need to be reflected in the training provided. And here comes the question, how can we raise teachers' language assessment literacy levels? Well, we've done already some very good work, and we have a lot to offer. And one of a major resource that we designed a couple of years ago, and it's still up and running and very successfully, I must say, is the work that we've done for the Teachers Assessment Literacy Enhancement Project, which was an Erasmus Plus funded project that created an open educational resource that's an online course, which as I said before, it's up and running, and a handbook for teachers. So this is the website that you can visit if you want to learn more about assessment, about the basics of assessment, about assessing reading, writing, listening, speaking skills, about providing feedback and alternatives in assessment, and how tests can impact on teaching and learning in the classroom through very interesting activities. And this is what you get when you log on to the platform, some very interesting and interactive activities that you can engage yourselves in and learn about assessment through a variety of activities, through input by watching videos, for example, or reading short articles, and extending your understanding of assessment through reading some interesting web-based and freely accessible readings. Of course, you can download the Handbook of Assessment for English Language Teachers that is on the website of TALE. And TALE is on social networks if you visit it, but if you haven't tried it out, do so. You're going to learn a lot about assessment. But there's so many more resources out there. Our recent engagement in a new project, also an EU-funded project, that it aims at raising levels of understanding of teachers using English as a lingua franca in especially multilingual classrooms, has already designed a very interesting professional development course that looks like this when you enter the environment of Enrich. And one of the bubbles is dedicated to language assessment where English is used as a lingua franca, and actually within multilingual environments. The video that we designed and the activities that we designed for teachers will be very useful in helping teachers understand on how to do language assessment in multilingual contexts. The platform and the materials will become accessible at the end of the summer, so keep a note of the website that you can visit in the future. But also for teachers who are working with students with learning needs such as dyslexia, there's another wonderful source where materials are freely accessible, and that's the Dyslexia for Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. There is a web-based course that was produced as part of DISTEFL, where teachers through activities and a lot of interesting input can understand and get to know about dyslexia. And there's a unit number 10, that is specifically dedicated to the assessment of language learners with dyslexia. On the same website, you can download the handbook for teachers of English as a foreign language working with dyslexic students. The British Council has also worked on an amazing resource where animated videos of between 3 to 8 minutes have been uploaded on a range of different aspects of assessment, ranging from test development over to using the CFR and technology and language assessment, that you can watch and learn about all these exciting aspects. Trinity College London also has a website with lively recorded interviews on the website that where a lot of good input is provided through these interviews. The British Council also offers a language assessment in the classroom MOOC that is freely available and offered throughout the year. And I highly recommend it because it's a very, very interesting course. And I'm sure you're going to benefit a lot from that. But other sources, like, for example, the A to Z of second language assessment repository with a lot of interesting references is freely and available online. The European Association for Language Testing and Assessment has also created a number of useful resources on their website, and you can log on. Here's the link on the top right-hand side, and you can also become members of the association because you can register for free. And a lot of SIGs also organize meetings. The classroom-based language assessment SIG will have its meeting on the 3rd of June, so you might like to join us for the event. Other associations, such as the ITEFL Association with a TSIG that is offering webinars throughout the year, is also a very interesting association. The ECML, that's the European Center for Modern Languages and European Commission, is also organizing seminars. And at Oslo, my university, Oslo Met University, has collaborated to host an event organized by CML in 2019, but also big association and examination units such as the Cambridge Assessment English is offering webinars for teachers. Pearson is also offering webinars, and they're freely accessible. You can download and listen to most of them. So ETS is also launching a new, hopefully very soon, course on how to teach English to young learners, with a lot of focus on assessing younger learners. And finally, a very interesting language resource titled Language Testing Resources website, with a lot of interesting videos and materials and readings that you can download and find out more about language testing and assessment. But other than online resources, of course, there are so many books on the market that you can work with and you can use as reference in the future. And this is just a tiny little collection of resources that you can refer to. But of course, the most important thing, as I said earlier, is the formalized language testing and assessment courses at university level or college level, and the pre and the in-service teacher programs that are offered prior to conferences and other teacher events. Presentations are becoming more and more frequent on aspects of assessment nowadays, but also I would encourage all of you to participate in events and present your own assessment projects and also publish your work through professional publications and newsletters for teachers. But I think the most important activity, the most important way of finding out about assessment is working together and creating communities of practice, that is teacher assessment teams that can work together in creating effective and practical assessments through collaborative assessment projects where a lot of action research can take place as well. So on this note, I'd like to say again and stress how very important it is to develop collaboration between teachers, collaboration between schools, and collaboration with those who can offer teacher education in terms of assessment. And needless to say, of course, that spending time working on either undergraduate level projects or postgraduate level projects or doctoral dissertation and assessment is really very important and fills in great gaps, and a lot more work is needed in the field, especially when it comes to assessing young learners. Right, I think I've taken a little bit more time than I should have, but I think that working in the field of language assessment is really very important. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides now and back to the main.
Okay, Dina, thank you so much for sharing with us. Yeah, actually, there are so many things we could say, we could talk about. So I know that people who are here today with us, they are popping out with questions and ideas. So thank you so much, Dina. So I'm glad to call now to call to our room Gladys, and by the end of this session we can see what people are questioning, what they are trying to figure out, what they are doing. So thanks again, Dina and Gladys. We are very, very happy to have you here. I know that most of you already know Professor Gladys Quevedo-Camargo, who is a friend of mine and is a partner who is also part of the research group. And I'm very happy to introduce her for those who don't know her. So Gladys Quevedo-Camargo holds a PhD in language studies and the RSA Delta Diploma in English Language Teaching to Adults. She works with English language teaching and teacher education at the University of Brasilia, UNB. She is co-founder and board member of Aula, Latin American Association for Language Testing and Assessment, and she's also member of the Brest-TESOL Assessment Special Interest Group. Her main areas of interest and research are language testing, classroom language assessment, and language assessment literacy. So Gladys, thank you so much for taking some time to be here with us today. So I'm going to talk in Portuguese a little bit. Então, Gladys, muito obrigada. Prazer tê-la aqui novamente, né? A professora Gladys tem estado conosco aí nessa... Eu acho que é esse desafio, né, Gladys, de entender um pouco mais como avaliar crianças aprendendo uma língua adicional, né, nessa perspectiva que nós temos trabalhado da educação linguística na infância. Então, Gladys, muito obrigada. Thank you so much. And take your time, dear.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, for this invitation to be here. I'm really honored and excited to be here with Dina because I'm a Dina's fan. So thank you very much.
We are actually. We are.
So thank you so much. It's as Dina said, when we start talking about assessment, the time flies. And so thank you, and it's a pleasure. I'm very happy because Dina said lots of things, and I can get hooks with what she said. For example, she mentioned language assessment literacy. And one of the things that she mentioned was the importance of knowing how to design instruments. So that's the hook I'm going to get. So could you please start sharing my slides? Thank you very much. So my talk, the title of my talk is Assessing Children's Language Development, Principles for Improved Tool Design. I'm going to use the word tool instead of assessment instrument because I'm using a metaphor in this talk. Okay, So I'm going to consider that an assessment instrument, is a tool to collect evidences. So that's why I'm going to use this word. Okay? So let's move on. Let's go to the next slide. Yes, so I tried to make this, this image of the learning cycle. So we have the teaching phase, we have tools that we use to carry out assessment for learning, as Dina said, or what we could also call that a formative assessment. So along the process, we check students' understanding, students' progress, and we collect evidence of this progress. And then we expect learning to happen. And usually at the end of the process, at the end of the phase, at the end of that period, we have another tool to collect evidence of achievement, which is normally considered assessment of learning or assessment of summative assessment. So I'm considering this this whole process, right? So we have to cater for the development of different tools. Now let's go to the next slide. So we have to use the right tool for the right job. This is a good expression. Of course, I'm taking it here metaphorically, but we cannot use a hammer when we have a screw, and we cannot use a wrench when we have a nail. We have to have the right tool for the right job. So that's what I'm going to stand for here. I'm going to stand for the right, I'm going to stand for the use of the principles of assessment to design the right tool for the right job. Okay? So let's move on now. Well, yes, the previous one. Can you come back, please? Leticia, come back, please. One more. Yes, thank you. So you probably remember that Dina mentioned some of these principles. So I'm going to expand them a little bit so that we can think about them and at the same time think about how we can use them to support the development of tools. So again, remember when I say tools, I'm not talking about tests, but I'm talking about any activity, any kind of instrument that we use to assess, to collect evidence in assessment for learning and assessment of learning, okay? So we have 8 principles: purpose, construct, validity, reliability, practicality, authenticity, ethics, and washback. So I'm going to go through them more or less quickly, okay? Now let's go to the first one, which is purpose. So Dina mentioned that we have to know why we're assessing. So this is number one. We have to ask ourselves, why am I going to assess? And what am I going to do with the evidences collected? So, for example, in this triangle by Asher, we have the principles for quality education. So why am I going to assess? I could assess for the purpose of accountability, meaning that I have to tell the people in charge, like educational authorities or the parents or the family, what's going on, how well the child developed. So this is accountability. I can also assess because I need to support my students' learning. I need to redirect my teaching. I need to feedback on my process. And I can also assess for any other reasons like certification, progress, from one year to another, from one level to another, and even transfer sometimes. The students have to move school. So we need to tell parents or the authorities, the level that student achieved. So knowing why and what we are doing is very, very important, and what you're going to do with those evidences, right? Okay, now let's move on. Let's go to number 2. Number 2 is construct. This is a word that normally causes some problems because it's not so easy to understand what a construct is. So construct is an abstract concept. It is a theoretical concept. And the question we should ask is, what is the knowledge, the skill, or the understanding drawn from the curriculum that I intend to assess? So I have to make clear what I am assessing. So I have to go through the definition of the construct. I have to define parameters for the construct to become operational, and I have to define ways to measure the construct. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's suppose our construct is fluency. Fluency is something that, it's very, well, you have lots of definitions in the literature. So we have to agree on one fluency. What is fluency for you? What kind of fluency are you talking about, right? So let's suppose that I define that fluency is related to hesitation. So this is my parameter for the definition of the construct, and so that I can make it operational. So I define fluency as a construct. I define that the parameter I'm going to use to measure that is hesitation. And then how am I going to measure that? For example, this is just a crazy example, but anyway, for example, I'm going to count how many times the student stops or hesitates, right? So this is a silly example. You could think about that for speaking, for reading, for writing, for anything, right? For proficiency. What is proficiency? So all these very broad, abstract, theoretical concepts, they need to be narrowed down, and we need to define parameters and decide how we're going to measure. It doesn't matter what construct that is, right? So there is always a narrowing down process, all right? Okay, fine. Now let's go to number 3. My number 3 principle is validity. Validity is very important, probably one of the most controversial concepts in assessment. There are many types of validity. So here I'm talking about 2 that I consider very important for the design of a tool. So the question I should be asking is my tool measuring what it is supposed to measure, considering what it was designed for and the students I have? So then I have to think about the alignment with the construct that I defined. So this is called construct validity. So for example, if I am checking speaking, I have to ask students to speak, right? So I have to align that with the construct. And also have to consider the alignment with the syllabus, which is called content validity. So first I have to have my syllabus in mind, my learning objectives in mind. And so if I put them together, and then I could say that my tool is valid for these parameters, for this context I defined. So other than that, it's not going to be valid. Of course, age has to be taken into account. That's why I have to think about my syllabus. I have to think about my construct, so that everything is aligned and I have a valid tool. All right, let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is reliability, and this is very important. So the question I should ask is, can I trust the evidences my tool produces or the information it gives me about my students? So does my tool give me a real idea of what my students know? Is there any contamination? So what I take into account is, for example, my students' familiarity with the tool format. Because if one day I come into class and I apply a tool, apply an assessment instrument that students have never seen before, that's going to contaminate the evidence collection. So how am I going to trust those evidences if they have never seen that tool before? So this is not valid. So I have to consider my students' familiarity with the tool format, right? So usually we use tools or instruments that we have used before in the classroom that students are really familiar with. I have also taken into account the fluctuations in correction. So we all know that, for example, if we have piles of writing essays or essays to correct, when you start, you are okay, you are rested, but at the end you are tired, it's late at night, or you are, after reading lots of different essays, so you have a different picture of what your students produced. So there are fluctuations that interfere. So, for example, if you are influenced by the nowadays with the pandemic, we have essays written on the computer, but in the past, when we had handwritten papers, we had to fight against the tendency of being influenced by the students' handwriting, right? When it wasn't clear, when it was, for example, oh, this handwriting is not very nice and it's difficult to read. So this is also included in fluctuations in correction. So every single element that is not in line, is not standardized, helps affect reliability, okay? Another thing is tool administration. So I have to make sure that the way I am administering the tool is reliable, is standardized, is uniform. So when we were in the classroom, any kind of noise, the way, for example, the light in the classroom, everything that could somehow distract students would have to be considered. Nowadays, because we are online, we have other elements. For example, if the student, the child is in his room, is it silent? Does he have or she have a reliable connection, for example? So all these elements related to the administration, then they can have a role in the reliability. And last one is tool design. So for example, if my tool has clear instructions, if I really explained what they have to do, if when we were, for example, in face-to-face teaching, we would worry about the copy, if the copy was clear, if the photocopy was okay, was well taken, right? Anyway, all these elements, they affect reliability. If I don't think about them, I have contamination in the design of my tool. Good. So now let's go to number 5. Number 5 is practicality. So the question I should ask is my tool practical? So first thing is to think about time. So is my tool short enough for the time I have? So isn't it too long? So do I have enough time to use to apply that tool or not? So I have to think about that. I also have to think about how much that would cost. So if there is any cost involved, when we were, for example, in face-to-face teaching, we will have to think about the materials we would need, if you would need a different kind of paper, a different kind of material, a different kind of pen, or anything like that. So nowadays, online, we don't have a cost issue, but we do have, for example, problems related to lack of connection or lack of a good piece of equipment, right? The other one is related to, the other element is related to administration. So if I have a class with 20 students, do I have enough room for them? Do I need help to use my tool? Do I need an assistant? Can I work with all of them at the same time, for example? So we also need to think about that. If I am online, can I monitor all of them at the same time? Is it possible? Or do I need help, right? Okay, and then last but not least, we have correction. So the tool that I designed, how long am I going to take to correct that? For example, some people think that having a multiple choice test or a quiz is much simpler, and actually it is simple, but simple to correct, but it's not so easy to design, because a very good multiple choice test or quiz to be very well designed takes time, right? Also, how much work will I have to devote to correct, for example, if I have open questions, right? If I have 30 students and I use open questions, how long will that take me to correct and give feedback? So these are practical issues that I have to think about when I design a tool. Right, now let's go to number 6. Number six is authenticity. And the question I should ask is my tool as close to my students' real life as possible? And here we have several elements to be taken into account. I have to start thinking about the concept of language that I have. So, for example, if I think that language is a set of structures, then of course it's a bit difficult to design tools that are close to students' real life. So to be able to do that, my concept of language should be more related to language as social practice or language as action. So people do things with the language. So knowing what to do with the language and not knowing about the language, right? So that would help me design tools that are closer to students' real life. And then that leads me obviously to focus on performance. So asking students to perform, to do tasks that sometimes somehow mirror what they do in real life. And this is very nice to do with kids and with teenagers, for example, right? Involving them in, for example, writing rules for games, for example, that they could share, they could talk to students, to their peers. So focus on performance, not on explaining the teacher what they know about the language again. And that leads me to the next one, which is plausible situations. Again, things that, resemble what students could have in their real lives, that could happen to them, not something completely strange to their realities, right? And of course, contextualized tasks. So students have to be put into context. They should understand why that's happening, why that situation is being, put in front of them. That leads us also to something that Dina mentioned, which is age-suitable themes and situations. So everything we do should take into account our students' age, our students' interests, if that's possible. So when we talk about children, as Dina showed, we have 3 different groups or 4 different groups of children, right, depending on the age. So they vary a lot. So we do need to know our students very well to choose the best themes and situations for them to perform with. And then last but not least, it's skills integration. In real life, we very unusually use one skill at a time. So we normally do things together. So we listen and write, or we read and write, or we speak and listen. So putting skills together, having performances with skills integration is also part of being authentic in the design of our tools. Okay, that's quite a lot about authenticity. Let's go to number 7. Good. So ethics is something that has been very, very, very important in the last years, especially because the assessment community is aware of how much assessment affects people's lives. So the consequences, the social consequences of assessment and testing are huge. So ethical issues have to be taken into account. So the question I should ask here is, does my tool comply with ethical principles? And then I raised here 4 issues: transparency, respect for privacy, fairness, and no prejudice or bias. So when we talk about transparency, what I mean is to, for example, to think about things like, do my students know what they're being assessed for? Do my students know the criteria? Have I shared the criteria with them? So am I being transparent? We all know that, for example, when we are going to take a test or we are going to go through the process, we want to know what's going to happen. We want to know what will be demanded from us. So it's the same with our students. So being transparent, sharing, okay, look, this tool, this activity, we're going to focus on this, on that. So this is part of transparency. Respect for privacy. There are two things that I would highlight in terms of transparency, in terms of respect for privacy. So first one is exposure. So exposing students' weak points is not good, right? And on the other hand, extremely exposing students' strong points is also bad. So we have to balance that and respect their privacy in terms of exposure, in terms of their relationship with the other friends, with the other colleagues. The second thing is privacy in relation to their grades. So it's as much as possible, we should try to respect, because sometimes comparing grades and showing other people their grades and talking to people about students that had high grades or low grades is not very ethical. So we should be careful with that, especially when we talk about children. The other element is fairness. And fairness is related to providing equal treatment as much as possible. Of course, respecting people's differences, but we have to consider their needs and try to do our best to provide them with fair treatment, everybody having opportunities that are the same. And the last one is no prejudice or bias. And here we have to remember that by the simple choice of, for example, specific texts or specific topics or specific images, we might be bringing some prejudice or some biased issues into the classroom. So sexism, racism, ethnical prejudice, this should also be avoided, of course, as much as possible. So we do need to be careful with images, texts, judgments, preferences that we have sometimes in the classroom, so that we have an ethical attitude in the tool we design. Okay, and number 8, my last principle, is washback. And the question I should ask is, what are the potential positive and negative washback effects that my tool could cause? So I have to remember, and Dina also mentioned that, positive washback. So I have to remember that washback could be positive and negative. So I wrote here examples. They're not the only ones, of course, but there are many. But I put 2 examples for positive, 2 examples for negative. So for example, a positive washback effect would be change in study habits, for example, in my students' study habits. Depending on the way I conduct assessment in the classroom, they might be encouraged to study in a different way. And if that's positive to them, then the washback is good. Also, by working well with assessment, by designing well my tools, I can also provide them with more autonomy, give them more chance to become autonomous. On the other hand, negative washback also happens. For example, when I give too much emphasis on a particular skill, I only work, for example, with writing most of the time in my classes, or I only work with reading most of the time in my classes. And also too much emphasis on language structure, for example, because then I give my students the message, I convey my students the message that structures are more important than performance. And we have to remember that we learn languages to communicate, we learn languages to do things in the world, to act in the world, and not just to use meta language about the language, right? Okay. Now going to the last part of my talk. Can we go to the next slide then? Right. So here I put lots of tools just to keep my metaphor. So use the right tool for the right job. So I think that these principles, they should be kept in mind for improved tool design. So the more careful we are with that, with this design, the better for us, the better for our students. So we can design different tools. So we just have to make sure we use the right one for the right moment, for the right assessment, for the right job. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gladys. So I would like to, she's back, Dina. So I would like to call here to join us. I know that there are many questions people are asking on the chat. So I'd like to call Professor Juliana to be here with us. And Juliana, so you have a chance to start with the question and answer session.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, Professor Gladys and Professor Dina. It was enlightening. It was wonderful. I have so many questions. I don't even know which one I could ask. Look at this. All the questions.
Oh my God.
Okay, I'm going to choose two questions. One related to the assessment itself, and another one related, if I have the chance to answer, to get both answers, right? The other one related to teacher education, which is my field, teacher education for young learners. So the first one is, I have a situation as an example. We have a group of teachers that teach a second language, foreign language, to young learners from 6 to 10 years old. And these teachers have been in this field for 15, 20 years. So they have all these ideas about testing, not assessment. Everything is about numbers, everything is about testing. What is one or two suggestions both of you might have so we can start shaking off these conceptions that they have about assessment, that is only a number? Assessment is on, they confuse assessment with testing. So this is one situation. It's about how can we shake it off, these ideas, and provoke some thoughts. What would you do first? It's one question. The other question is, as professors, as teachers, language teachers, and evaluators, because all of us use these tools, right? Is there a balance we should develop as teachers, as evaluators, so we don't oppress children about their achievements, about our goals when we are assessing them? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Thank you, Juliana. Gladys, is it okay if I start first, responding to the first question, and then you take on the second one, and then I'll come back if I want to say something? Is that okay?
Yes.
Right? Okay. Back to your first question, Juliana. Well, that's a case. That's a case study, and I think I know what you're up to. But anyway, just very quickly. Well, it's very important to start with what teachers do. Like, I would ask teachers, like, what is it that you do? How do you test your students? And the next question would be, what are you happy with and what are you not so happy with, right? Because it's very important to see, actually it's very important to capitalize, to use teachers' experience, because it's valuable, it's very important. And you can't go into any kind of seminar or workshop and tell teachers, you know, what you've been doing is wrong, and I'm here to teach you what you should do. That's really wrong. And we should not start like this, because teachers have a lot they know. They know the ins and outs of their daily realities. They are very aware of restrictions and challenges that probably we don't know when we go out to train teachers into language assessment. So first we need to listen to them, find out what they do, find out what it is they're challenged by and with, and just listen to their voices. But then try to make them aware of what it is that works and what it is that doesn't work. But this needs to be done in collaboration with teachers. So this is where I would start first, before I shake their world, before I help them become aware or realize really what it is they should be thinking about. Not really changing, but transforming themselves in the way they understand assessment. And of course, creating what I said earlier, communities of practice, which is very important, trying to understand that they are not alone in this, and there are so many others around them that they can reach out for help, or they can reach out for support. They can reach out when they want to pilot or share their assessment babies, for example, because this is all very sensitive, and they need to know that there are so many others that can help or can be used as a way of support. And you know, it's better to put two heads together rather than work in isolation most often, because assessment should not be looked at as a very isolating process. Rather, it's all about sharing and improving and making it better. And it's through these kind of communities that we can gain our confidence in the way we assess our students' performance, our students' abilities, because this will always reflect back, and it should go back to what it is that we're doing in the classroom. And share a lot of examples. That's very important, I think. Just telling teachers what to do is not enough. Teachers need to see examples. So bringing other teachers' work, or bringing teachers who have tried working with alternatives in assessment, and informing others who would like to experiment a little bit outside the usual kind of, testing approach to assessment would be a good way to start. Because, sometimes even us educators or trainers are not very, what can I say? I don't want this to come out not very nicely, but we're not always trusted. And it's only colleagues at the same level that can be trusted when they try their hands on other types of assessment. So using others as examples and as models might bring the change and transformation in how teachers understand and practice assessment, or how they think around assessment. So this for me, in response to your first question, Juliana.
Thank you so much. Wonderful answer. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, about the second question, you're asking about how to balance our assessment, the way we assess, and in the classroom, not to oppress. This word is strong, right? Oppress children regarding achievement. Well, I don't know. I think this idea of oppressing children is in our minds as adults. I think children don't see that as being oppressed, because children like achieving things. They see that as positive, right? And we should do that too. So it all depends on how you do that in the classroom. For example, if you create an atmosphere that is tense, that is punitive or things like that, of course, okay, I agree, it's pressure and oppression. But on the other hand, if the assessment is carried out in a way that children, for example, play and do things and accomplish things, I think this is good for their self-esteem. It's good for their growth, right? And then that's why I said something about not exposing people too much, because all of them could achieve something, and that's good for them, for their self-esteem, and for their own view of themselves, the way they see themselves. So I think that the balance is in the teacher's hand, in the sense that he should design the tool very well. So that's a pleasure for kids to be part of that moment. And you are assessing, you're collecting information. So you're not oppressing them. You're not putting pressure on them. I don't know. Dina, anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Gladys. And actually, I'd like to bring in our discussion methods of assessment, such as self and peer assessment. because I think students need to be involved, and student involvement in assessment is very important. Creating environments where the student agency is put on the spot is very important, because this makes students responsible as well, and so they take part of the responsibility of their growth and development. But students need to be trained, they need to become aware of how to take and how to do self-assessment, for example, and what that means to them. And there needs to be, of course, a follow-up to any type of self-assessment with clear understanding of how to do this and what the assessment means for them and how to take things forward. So there needs to be a lot of, for example, student-teacher conferencing or private meetings. And the same goes for peer assessment, but not really assessment when it comes to peers, because this is really sensitive. Maybe perhaps peer feedback, we can call it like that, on the basis of very specific criteria that also are communicated to students, or maybe designed with students at the same time before using them, to provide feedback and support for each other. And all this could end up, for example, in a student portfolio, or students can work on a project. So we can create authentic tasks and authentic opportunities for students to engage students in processes where self-assessment and peer assessment is the core kind of assessment procedures that students can participate in. And so making the assessment process more visible and more supported through this kind of methods, I think is important, especially when it comes to young children and young learners, generally speaking, even though there's quite a lot in the literature that can support the use of self-assessment and peer assessment even for young ages. Even when students and learners are developing their critical skills, there are ways around it. And I think the self-assessment grades of the European portfolio that are available and ready for anyone to use and adopt, I think that's a good way to go if somebody is novice and first-time user of self-assessment or peer assessment. And of course, there's so much literature out there and a lot of good tools, as Gladys referred to earlier, on how to do that. So the fun element and the spaces and the atmosphere in the classroom is far from being oppressive when the students engage themselves in these processes and they know that they're responsible for their own development and their own evaluation. And so evaluation and assessment becomes part of their daily life in the classroom, whether it's physical presence or online classrooms, especially these days.
Okay, thank you so much, Juliana, for your question, and also Gladys and Dina for shedding some light on the issue. I'd like just to make a comment on what Gladys said. Of course, we would have so many things to talk about here, but Gladys said many things important, of course, but something that called my attention is that we have, the thing you said, Gladys, about the importance of children playing and doing things, right? I totally agree with that, but I still think it's a big challenge for us, at least here in Brazil, for us to have clear criteria, assessment criteria, when we put children or when we use playful activities as assessment, an instrument of assessment, right? Can you just say something about that, Gladys? I know that it would take us the whole night, but do you agree it's important? How do you see it? Because I know that it's quite common for us to let children playing, right, doing things, but I don't know if it's part of our culture, right? Seeing or taking these moments of playing and doing things as an assessment opportunity, right? Would you What would you say about that?
In the classroom has a reason. So we have learning objectives to be fulfilled, right? We have things to do. It's not just they're playing because they're playing and it's nice, right? If we have learning objectives, the playing, in inverted commas, is a learning moment. It's not a playing moment that just happens because they're children. So it is fun. It looks like playing, but it's a learning moment. So as a learning moment and also as a potential assessment moment, it should have criteria. And the criteria for us to look at comes from the learning objectives. You see? So I think that we say playing, so it gives us the idea that it's something without any guideline. It's just, okay, let's play. No, we're teaching, right? So we have done something to accomplish. We have a reason. We have something to do during the class. So we should have the criteria. Don't know. Agree, Dina?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, engaging students in play and fun activities is not just fun and play. Absolutely. The aims, the learning aims can turn into assessment aims and clear criteria that focus perhaps on the process, but also on the outcome of any fun game and any fun activity are very important. So for this level, of course, fun and play are very important, and there are so many interesting activities that can create the fun element and the play element, from physical activities to online and digital plays, gamification, for example, and loads of games these days produce that fun element. But the outcome of the game surely is the assessment output of the process that the students will engage in. And definitely this needs clear aims and clear criteria for the assessment of the outcome of the production of any kind of game or any kind of fun activity.
Thank you. I think Gabriele has a question.
Yeah, and I think I can hook it up from what you're saying. We're talking about games and playing, and how sometimes teachers don't see that when you have learning objectives, criteria, you can assess kids from playing, from games, and so on. Well, my background as a teacher, as an English teacher, comes from a franchising model of English teaching, and when I entered a regular school, and I didn't know what to do. Like, my graduation didn't prepare me to assess kids. And then I need to say I'm very ashamed of what I have done back there. And then when I started to learn about it, to study about it, I noticed how important it is language assessment literacy. And that's why I took a discipline at PPGEL, at UEL, with teacher Viviane Baggio. I think she was here. I saw some of her students here too. She's excellent. She's very nice, a very nice teacher. And I learned a lot with her. And I noticed the importance of this language learning, language assessment literacy through her. And then I ask you, would you say, you two, both of you, would you say that there's a different set of skills that language teachers of very young learners, not just young learners, but very young learners, these teachers who teach very young learners, they should have to conduct assessment for learning? I mean, for learning, because when I go back to franchising model of teaching English, we just we just didn't do it. We didn't assess children back there. And then when we go to regular school, it is incredibly necessary to assess for learning. And then my question is, would you say there's a different set of skills, a different kind of literacy that teachers should have, should do this fairly, like Gladys said, all those principles, taking all those principles into account and conduct an assessment fairly due to the development process they are going through?
Absolutely. Gladys, do you want me to go first and then?
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, Gabrielle, please don't feel guilty and don't feel sad or disappointed, because that's what's been happening to all of us. We start to assess the way we've been assessed, right? So very often, because of lack of training or information or input, we tend to rely on what we know, and what we know is our experience. So, it doesn't come naturally. Of course, we need the support and we need the training. So don't feel bad about not having it when you entered a classroom full of young learners. With time and with training, and of course updating and reading and following up recent developments, we learn about those things. And it's very important that training comes in to change and to transform the way we think and the way we practice. We are all probably products of our own testing or test-oriented system. So it was through our professions and through our studies at university and elsewhere that we found out that assessment of learning, and especially assessment of young learners in particular, is a place, or is an aspect of assessment that has a rightful place within the much larger assessment landscape. So in terms of language assessment literacy, does it differ for those who are assessing young learners? I think it does, to some extent. Because one needs to understand, of course, the complications and understand the developments and what it is that young learners know and can do at this, because especially when working with very young ones that are still growing, they're learning the world, and they pick up their own mother tongues along with another second or even a third language. Of course, these need to be part of any type of training or any type of consideration of language assessment literacy. And any teacher who assesses young learners needs to understand that these students are still developing cognitively, developing linguistically, developing in terms of affective factors as well. They're learning the world, they're experimenting with language. They want to have fun. They want to take part in fun activities. So therefore, our assessments need to be as close to these different developmental aspects of growing and becoming kids and becoming toddlers, getting from very young ones into learning about the world and understanding and picking up more academic skills. So any kind of understanding at this level would only lead to successful assessment. And so introducing assessment methods or assessment approaches that are used with adult learners will only lead to very unsuccessful assessment in the classroom. So trying to bring in a lot of multiple choice items with very long texts, or asking young students to define vocabulary, that's a recipe for disaster. When we all know that young ones would only come to a level where they would immediately map, for example, the auditory version of any kind of lexis with pictures, and how important it is to bring visual elements into our assessment, or how important it is to develop speaking before writing, and how important it is to develop listening, for example, before any other skill, because speaking and listening are the first priorities, especially when it comes to teaching young learners any kind of language, not just their mother tongue, but also second and third languages. So these and many more other things need to come into any attempt to raise the language assessment literacy of teachers of young learners. Gladys, over to you.
Wow, no, nothing to add. I totally agree with you. It's not just, well, I agree with you that we shouldn't feel guilty. I think everyone has been through that. And that's why we're here. That's why we're learning, always reading, always trying to learn, always trying to talk to people and finding ways of working as, in a better way, finding different activities. That's why it's important to have what you mentioned, that collaborative work, communities of practice, because we need to learn. It's not just enjoying working with kids. You have to know them. You have to study and know what kind of things they can do. As Dina said, their cognitive abilities. So I totally agree with what you said, Dina. Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Gabriele, for bringing this issue here, and also Gladys and Dina for the wonderful, I wouldn't say answers, but provocative thoughts, right? We have so much to do. So we have a question here. I think, yeah, it's here. I think that somehow Dina has already mentioned something on that, but anyways, we have a question from Thais, and she asks if we could say that self-assessment and peer assessment are techniques of assessment for learning.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Thais. That's the case. Very often self-assessment and peer assessment are used as methods that can support assessment for learning for as long as they provide qualitative feedback. However, if teachers want to quantify that and allocate, for example, numbers or grades, or map any kind of performance onto criteria that are quantified, then they might lead to assessment of learning and be used for summative purposes. But I think it's better and it's safe to use self-assessment and peer feedback or peer assessment as techniques of assessment for learning that can support learning. And this can be done systematically throughout the year by engaging students in self-assessment tasks, for example, at the end of the week or at the end of a fortnight or at the end of the month. And this can become a regular practice in the classroom, because bringing it in and integrating it with other activities, students would probably anticipate to do their self-assessment, and especially if this is followed up by individual feedback and working together with teachers and other students, creating smaller communities of practice in the classroom, I think it can move things forward and it can only lead to learning outcomes for the students.
Gladys, would you like to add?
No, nothing to add. No, I totally agree. Yes, nothing to add.
Okay, so we have a question that was sent via email beforehand. And Dina, the situation we have here in Brazil, Gladys, I'm sure she knows what I mean, is that, as I said before, since I'm going to talk about English, right? Because this is the most common additional or foreign language offered here in Brazil. So since the teaching of English is not compulsory for young learners or in primary schools, right? What we have is the following. So we have what we call the teachers, how can I say that? The teacher's classroom, right? That person who stays with the kids throughout the period, right? Who is not the English teacher or the Spanish teacher. So there is a question that we received beforehand, and it's a student of mine, Mariana, and she asks the following. So usually, foreign language teachers for children do not participate during the process of preparing activities, nor in the process of assessment along with other teachers, so these classroom teachers, right? Is it possible to think about language education? I mean, we mean by language education, we mean teaching another language, right? Without considering all achievable languages approach at school. I think that what Mariana meant is, how can we work? How can we English teachers, how can we work with very young learners or young learners apart from the classroom teacher? Is it possible to do that, or we should work together? Do you understand the question?
I think I do, maybe not entirely, but I'll try to answer the question. And if it's not satisfactory enough, then Gladys can help. I think it's really very important to collaborate with others, and actually collaborative competence needs and should become one of the very many dimensions of language assessment literacy. And it's at the core, and it's the heart of any attempt to introduce any type of assessment in the classroom for young learners to be shared with others, if at all possible. So relying on others, not relying on others, but asking for support from others, especially if you're a novice in the assessment of young learners, is very important. I understand how difficult it is to do this first time round. But you know, at the end of the day, it's the students, it's the learners on the receiving end that are going to benefit from this kind of collaborations. And collaborations need to start within our schools, within our regions, before they become bigger, maybe perhaps turning into a bigger project that is implemented in the region or the district. But it's very important that we all recognize the need to ask for help and support from others, especially when we don't feel confident enough with what we've selected. But even if we do, it's important to ask others to look at our assessment choices for all kinds of reasons. Gladys earlier talked about reliability and validity. So to secure and safeguard reliability and validity, we need to pilot and we need to validate our choices, our assessment choices, by asking others to have a look at them, to try them out, to pilot them. So it's very important to support and to ask for support from others. Mm-hmm. So collaborative competence and collaborations are necessary when it comes to assessment, because, you know, we are only humans. We might make mistakes, or others might learn from our work, and it's important to be shared.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of working together for the students' benefit, because if we're working with children, you are talking about a holistic education. You're not just talking about language items. So in the language classroom, for example, you can also work with motor coordination, for example, right? If you're working with very young learners, you can also help with the personality development. You can work with other things that go beyond the language elements. So I think this overall picture is important. I know, I agree with Dina, it's difficult sometimes, but it's a work that has to be done, and this awareness has to be raised in the school, in the group, whatever.
And I think Gladys, teachers are already doing it, because, you know, what the COVID situation, even though it brought us to the end of our tether, I mean, it made all of us really stressed. We turned to each other for help and support, to understand how to use Zoom, for example, or WebEx, or any of the platforms. So we're already doing it, you know, for all the kinds of logistical skills that we've developed over the very many months we're working online. So this is no different from sharing our assessment tasks, or sharing our assessment ideas, or our assessment practices in the classroom. The way we ask for help from others to know how to operate within Zoom, it's the same thing, reaching out for others to help us with implementing portfolio assessment, for example, or using fun or game activities in the classroom and asking others to help us design criteria, for example, of introducing self-assessment or working on a number of new statements. I think we're already doing it. We're already asking for help. So it's no different from asking each other on how to improve any type of assessment task that we are about to introduce with our students. I think teachers already have developed a lot of confidence in doing it. And I think they got out of their way asking for help in the middle of the night, especially when they had a class at 9 o'clock in the morning using Zoom and they didn't know how to do that. I think we're good at that already.
That's true. That's true. So I think we are coming to the end of this wonderful talk. Before we end it, I would like to ask Dina if you could say something you would like to invite people on the event you just shared with us that's going to happen this coming Saturday. Maybe people are interested in taking part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'd like to tell you a little bit about a conference that is organized by the University of Athens in Greece, actually the Department of English Language and Literature, in collaboration with the International Language Testing Association, supported also by the Center of Excellence for Multilingualism and Language Policy. The title of the conference is Assessment in Multilingual Contexts, Trends and Challenges in Foreign Language Education. The event is taking part on Saturday, and it will start in the morning. Well, that's actually morning in Athens, Greece, around 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's going to finish at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's going to be our early hours in the morning for you to catch up with the morning sessions, but hopefully you can attend part of the conference. There are very many interesting presentations, all the way from multilingual testing to the practice and challenges of assessing language learners in multilingual classrooms and classroom-based assessment, to inclusive and instructional assessment practices with neurodiverse foreign language learners, and the use of feedback in assessment for learning, for example. Other topics such as multilingual assessment, and especially towards developing ELF-aware assessment practices, and the assessment of less taught and less learned languages are going to be the topics of this conference. I have already shared the link with Juliana earlier on, and the information is also on most of our Facebook pages. So if you want to know about this conference, please hurry up, because today is the last day for registration. We'll be very happy to have all of you with us on the day, and I promise it's going to be a super interesting event coming on Saturday. So that's from me.
Okay.
Juliana, on that?
Yeah, so thank you so much. I'm sure that we could stay here all night long. So Dina, once again, it was a pleasure to have you here. We hope to have other opportunities to talk about that. Gladys, same way, thank you so much. I think it's vital for us, this kind of sharing things, as you said, because we have so much to learn, so much ahead, so many things to do. So thank you so much. Thanks for, I'd like to also thank my students who are here asking questions, and thanking you both for this great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina.
I'd like to take
Very nice talking to you.
It's always a pleasure, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to address a wonderful group of PhD students, MA students, practitioners. I can't see you, but I'm hoping that you're going to go away with at least something new and something old that you've already confirmed as good practice. So I hope your takeaways are going to go straight into the classroom with your students. I'll be very happy, as I said, to see some of you or all of you on Saturday and follow the very many events that we are organizing from Norway, Greece, and other European countries that are online and freely accessible. And I'll make sure that Juliana is following on that, and she's going to be sharing, and of course Gladys will be sharing quite a lot of all these events in the future. I hope that you will be able to download the handbooks for language teachers, what with the handbook for English language teachers from the TEO website and the DISTEFL website, and I'll be very happy to share the slides with Juliana, and she can disseminate them to all of you, because these are very important resources that you can visit and you can learn from. So thank you all for being with us. It's been 2 full hours full of excitement and sharing and discussing and interacting with all of you, and thank you for the wonderful questions. And thank you, Gabriela, Juliana, and Gladys. And of course, the wonderful person that right now I forget the name, who was asking all the kind questions. Thank you, Juliana. Yes, I remember it. So thank you all for listening to us. Thank you, Gladys, for the very many interesting responses. And it's always a pleasure to be working with wonderful people from your part of the world. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you all. Keep safe.